All right. Well, guys, seriously, this is just some of the contact information. You can get a hold of me if there's anything I can ever do. Or if you just have some time to pray and you want to pray for somebody, I will always accept your prayers. That was supposed to be a joke. When Marty had asked me if I would be willing to speak about breaking or identifying and overcoming numerical growth barriers, I told him I would, but I want to be really honest with you. Even though church growth, church revitalization, and leadership development is really a passion, those are three passions of mine in the ministry, I will be totally honest to tell you that a lot of the church growth stuff I have learned has been in hindsight. I was not 15 years ago thinking, oh, okay, I understand church growth barriers, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. A lot of that was a result of me being able to look back and see how God was working in particular things, using people, situations, but it's also become a discipline of mine, a hobby of mine in a sense, of studying church growth, and of course church growth barriers play a part of that. So before we even really get started into looking at some of those church growth barriers, I want us to be able to ask ourselves the question is, why do we want our church to grow? And I think that's a really relevant question for us in a situation like this. And especially when we're talking about church growth barriers, we can almost speak about the mechanics of it to the point that it almost loses a bit of the spirituality. And we definitely don't want that to happen. I'm not trying to talk about simple mechanics without employing or speaking about the power and the direction of God. But I think for us, and I wrote this down because I wanted to say it like this, the purpose for this breakout is not to learn how to build a big church, but to seek to be faithful with what God has called us to have. So that we might realize what the potential is He has for the church, and then seek to maximize that potential to the best we can. So I also want this to be able to be an opportunity for you guys to be able to ask questions. I am definitely not the world's foremost authority, but I can share with you a lot of the mistakes I've made. So if you want to know any of those, we can talk about them. The first question really for us, as we kind of set this up, is do growth barriers really exist? We got one resounding yes. It's funny how growth barriers, how the idea of growth barriers came about. About in the 70s, there started to be this phenomenon of the super church, which later turned into the mega church. Now, what differentiated really the super church of the 70s from the large churches before was that the large churches that have been around were mostly in metropolitan areas. They were places where you had an established Baptist church, an established presence. So they were large by nature. But when the 70s came around, you started to see this new phenomenon of churches in Lynchburg, Virginia, growing phenomenally. You saw this phenomenal growth. So people are starting to wonder, why are these churches growing like this? So a lot of research went into it. And you guys at Southern Baptist, we know we have one of the best research arms in the world. We have great ability to be able to get numbers. If nothing else, than the ACP report that we fill out. But what happened is a lot of these research firms went in and they wanted to study and research and understand what made these churches grow. So when they would take all of these numbers and demographics on churches, what they found were there were some natural ceilings, meaning church attendance would climb so high and then stop. It was like a natural breaking point. Now, when we're talking about barriers, we have to realize that these are not hard and fast rules. What the barrier that I'm experiencing in my church, for instance, my 400 barrier, I believe in our context came at 350. And that's just because of the situation. We'll talk a little bit more about that earlier. But just because it's a number that we have seen a lot of churches stop at does not mean that that's the exact number for you. Okay? Your context may provide you a little more wiggle room on the other side or a little more wiggle room down below. Not always a hard and fast rule. And in studying growth barriers, what kind of growth barriers are there? Because I think a lot of times we think of like just the attendance, something's wrong. Two main types of growth barriers. External and internal. One of these you can do something about. One of these is a little more difficult. I want to look at external barriers for a minute. Community, population, saturation of similar churches, perception and reputation of church in community and location. Those are things that you don't have a lot of control over that can drastically affect your church. I don't know really so much what it's like in central Kansas, western Kansas. I know Kansas and Nebraska are still considered new work states. Aren't they still, Marty? Still new work states. I came from Kansas, being familiar with the state convention. I go over to Missouri, and you can't throw a rock without hitting a Southern Baptist church. I wouldn't recommend throwing a rock at a Southern Baptist church in Missouri. But there are so many of them. And my demographic, the place where I'm at, is different if you were to take that same church and place it in a context in central or south central Kansas. The saturation of similar churches is much different. We have a lot of similar, like-minded churches in our community. You may not have that. So these growth barriers, the community, population, you're obviously not going to be able to grow a huge church if you don't have the population to draw from. It's just, barring the power of God that we spoke of this morning, for the most part, it's very difficult to overcome that. The perception and reputation of church in your community, that's huge. That's huge. That can be an invisible barrier. I mean, that can be one that you don't even know exists. I'll give you an example. I've been at the church I pastor for 9.5 years. I just found out that our church does not have a good reputation. Now, of course, you think, okay, people say, oh, First Baptist Church, oh, you're from Mandy County, right? You get that kind of thing sometimes. So in the past, when I would hear whispers about that, that's kind of where I found it. But we bring on a children's minister. Our children's minister's husband is now going into the community, and he's looking for some jobs. So he would tell the people when he was applying, the first place he went to, he was telling them, he said, hey, my wife took a job as a children's minister at First Baptist Joplin. And they went, ooh, First Baptist Joplin. And he was like, okay. Didn't say anything. Went to a second place. Said the same thing. Different location, different place. And they said, ooh, First Baptist Joplin. And he's like, something serious going on. He goes to a third place. You know what they said? Same thing. He comes to me. He's like, hey, what's the reputation of our church in town? I said, well, it's great. It's wonderful. And he said, well, I went to these 3 different places, and they seem to think differently. So when you think about it, I think a lot of times, as pastors, especially in leadership, we have a view of how our church is perceived in the community, but that may not be true. Statistically, they say it takes 6 years for a new pastor to be able to overcome the image of the church. So I would have thought after 9 years we'd have been on our way, but not necessarily the case. Okay, there's still perception beyond Location is another one. Location. I mean, anytime you're dealing with real estate, location, that can play a serious role in a church. People aren't going to come to your church if they don't know where it's at. If it's hard to find, if it's difficult. Those are all external barriers. Y'all have any questions about external barriers? Or any thoughts? Any additions, some other external barriers you can think of?
Just as you were talking about perception, I was just thinking about how your perception can be different in various groups in the community. Like, for example, different socioeconomic levels perceive things differently. And so, you can have a church that, if you ask the professionals in the community, well, yeah, this is a church that's, they've done X, Y, Z. They have a different scale of what makes something good. Or if you ask, the core of the community, and a lot of times, the perception is built on, well, what have they given? Whether to themselves or to somebody else that they know.
That's a good point.
And I know that just from studies on poverty in general, that as that those relationships are what's most valuable, and a lot of times people are quick to throw you out. It's like, well, if there was a moment that this was your chance, now I've thrown you out, and I'm going to tell everybody that you're terrible. And so sometimes that perception can be grounded in how you respond to the poor in the community.
To bounce off of that, 2 of those 3 places, all 3 of those were apartment complexes. And 2 of those 3 places I know specialize in low-income housing. So that could, be some kind of a factor in that, really. I mean, I think because anytime you have an established church in an established community, at First Baptist, you have that dynamic. have to either overcome or embrace one or the other, you know. And that is, oh, well, they're the suit and tie, you know, or, you know, that's where the so-and-sos go. Country club kind of mentality. And that may be some of it. That's a really good point. I'm going to use that in my next session. That's why I asked the questions, actually. Any other thoughts on external barriers? Do what? Let's look at some internal barriers. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading over those. They are pretty self-explanatory. Don't need a whole lot of description. But one of the things I do want to say is that's just a splattering of internal barriers. Some of these are going to follow us through this journey from the 100 barrier to the 200 barrier to the 400 barrier. What you're going to find as we move through these barriers is that some of these internal barriers will play a larger role at different times in your church. Other ones will play less of a role at different times. It's amazing to see how those things can fluctuate. And these are the three that we're going to be dealing with. And these can be broken up. If you go back and look at different researchers, some of them put it at 350 to 450. Some of them put them at ranges. Some of them even say the first barrier you have to overcome is 50. For the sake of our time together, I want to focus on three that are generally accepted ranges, and that is the 100, the 200, and the 400. So let's look at a few that I have seen in my life, experienced personally, and have also been able to see these overcome. And looking at that, some of the things that happen from that. And by the way, I wrote 50% out there. Research is all over the place on this, but for the most part, researchers, the average is 50% of churches in the United States will not overcome the 100-person barrier. Half of the churches in the United States are 100 people or less. The major ones you see, the major barriers are seating capacity, attitude toward growth, facilities, quality of ministries, and people. I don't want to, seating capacity we'll talk a little bit more about at the 200 barrier, but the attitude toward growth, this one is huge. I mean, this one is really, really huge. When you are coming into, or when you're a part of a church that is small, one of the great things you have is a family atmosphere. You have people that have worshiped together, in a lot of our contexts, they've worshiped together for a long time. They've celebrated the births of babies. I mean, they know family members, they know friends, they know who's down the road. There is a really close-knit community. In fact, one of the great things we have as small churches is the fact that we're not surprising anybody by our size. I mean, really, think about it. When you have somebody walk into your church, if you pastor a church that's 100 or less, more than likely the people that are coming in realize your church is 100 or less. And you know why that's important? Because they chose to be there. There's something about the 100 or less church that they like. You know, it's kind of a funny exercise. This came to me helped me realize this when I was studying the book called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. It was a great book. I was reading it last summer. And by the way, I see some of you writing. If you read that book, there are cuss words in it, okay? I wanted you to know that. I'm not. I just feel like now I got that off my chest. It's like, there's not a Christian book, it's just a leadership book, okay? But one of the things I'm doing with my church is with some small groups. I will ask them what their favorite restaurant is. And they'll tell me. So I'm just going to play this game, okay? What's your favorite restaurant?
Great.
And why?
Ribs.
And it's ribs. Food.
Yeah, food.
Okay. Anybody else want to play this game? There's a reason for it. Todd, what's your favorite restaurant? Well, you only know Nashville restaurants.
So my favorite is not in the community I live in.
Sure.
I love Longhorn Steakhouse.
Okay.
Because they have Parmesan crusted chicken and it's stupid good.
Okay. Longhorn Steakhouse, because they have Parmesan crusted chicken and it's stupid good. End quote. You're welcome. Now, after I ask people in my church, what their favorite restaurant is and why, what I get predominantly is the food is good, the service is great, the price is right. One of those three, if not all of those three. And that's how we make up our mind, isn't it? On where we're going to eat or what's our favorite. Is the food good? Is the price right? Is the service great? Sometimes we'll throw in, is the place clean? But those responses are all fact-based responses. It's a fact. To me, that food's good. It's a fact that the price is right. Then, if you turn to your people, after you've asked them what their favorite restaurant is, say, why did you choose this church to join? If you're a part of this church, why did you choose this church? And you know what you'll probably find? 9 out of 10 of those that respond will use this word, feel. Felt. Feeling. We felt like it was home. We felt like the people loved us. Now, don't get me wrong. People aren't going to your church because of your food. But it does highlight a significant factor in our church life, is that people aren't making the decision of your church based off of facts. They're making the decision off whether they want a long-term relationship with your church based off of feelings. And fact part of our brain and the feeling part of our brain are two totally different parts. Now, I'm not saying this to manipulate people's feelings. That's not what I'm doing. But what I am saying is that people use feelings. And nobody in the world is equipped to be able to connect with first-time guests better than the 100-person and under church. You know, Fuller Institute of Church Health did research, and they found out that regardless of the size of the church you're in, the average person only knows 70 people. Isn't that amazing? Regardless of the size of the church you're in, the average church member only knows, 70 people. So this church right here has a strength, a potential strength in their family atmosphere, the people that come in. They're not surprised. They want to be there. The problem comes in our small churches in this area is when the people come in and they are not welcomed, or they are not greeted, or they have to go through it. There's a clique that they can't get into. So one of the important things about this is realizing that we have the 100 and under group church is poised to be able to reach the people in a way that other larger churches are not necessarily equipped. The other things on this attitude toward growth, that is going to be a huge barrier. That can be a huge barrier. You may have people that love that family feel, love that small feel because of control, because of tradition, because of fear of change. Those are all big issues. They are real powerful issues in a small church. And that's something that if you're really going to be able to grow past that church has to be able to adopt an outwardly focused, welcoming environment into their place. To not be afraid of new people, but to embrace those that come and visit. Now, that's something that, I was talking with the pastor just 4 or 5 weeks ago, and he was telling me that he was wanting his church to be more outwardly focused. And I said, well, do you have a plan or a strategy? And he said, well, I'm going to preach a couple sermons coming up on being outwardly focused. And he said, do you think that's going to work? And I told him, I don't know. But what I do know is this, is that oftentimes as pastors, we feel like that we pray, plan, and prepare for our sermon to change every heart in that church. And we should. We should pray, plan, and prepare to the extent that sermon is going to change every heart in that church. But what I have seen, and the reality that I've experienced most, is that churches don't change through sermons and even sermon series. They change through seasons. And it needs to be a continued conversation with the congregation about being able to be welcoming and open to those first-time guests. Being willing to give up control in order to be able to see that church grow. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I think one of the things about particularly that 50 size group is they'll say that they're a friendly church.
Mm-hmm.
But you let somebody come in that they don't know, you'll find that they're friendly with the people they're friendly with.
That's good. Yeah.
And that one of the things that they have to do, and I mean, I experienced this in the pastorate, is that you have to have folks who say, well, I don't know these new people. I said, how do you reckon you're going to get to know them?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I told some folks, listen, if you see an invitation, invite them out to Sunday dinner, I'll pay for it.
Yeah.
And they said, well, that's the only way you're going to get to know these people.
see the issue, the dynamics that takes place is, with the people that come into the small church, come into it because they're looking to be part of a small church, because of the family atmosphere, then it becoming a larger church becomes a threat to why the kingdom is beginning.
That's right. And the familiarity breeds contempt. My wife was raised in a church of like 30. Her dad is not a believer. He only goes every once in a while. And so because they know him so well, the response is usually, oh, the risk of all that because you're here. It's because they know him, because they know each other, they almost feed on each other. Just because they feel like they can, and they don't know what that's, they don't understand what that can be.
Wow, that's a good point.
We talk about that things aren't going to change because, one sermon or sermon series about.
In my experience, they have.
Right. I totally agree with that. I read the other day that a lot of times when we find ourselves in these numbers and we want to grow, that the idea of being outwardly focused or mission minded or however you want to say it can't be a one-time event. It can't be, well, we're going to have revival, that it has to be through the seasons, that it has to be who we are, that it can't just be who we're going to be at Easter or who we're going to be at Christmas, but it has to be who we are all the time, because one, it takes more than one contact with a person to get them in, to get them to stay, and then two, you have to meet people at the different seasons of their life and what they're going through, and they may not be as responsive today as they will be in a month. And if you're outwardly focused today and not in a month, then you miss it. So that has to become a lifestyle, I guess, of your church or a characteristic of your church, not just at this moment this month we're gonna have a focus on being outward. We're gonna do it year round, So
It's like a completely new DNA that you need to work into the culture of the church. It's not just we're going to do a month of a focus. It's going to be a culture shift.
The DNA in that lifestyle, it has to start, I think, with the pastor or with the leadership, because like it or not, you're in a glass house, and if you're not welcoming, but you're telling the church to be welcoming, well, you already sunk your own boat.
I'll tell you though, it starts with the pastor, and no doubt the pastor needs to be the main guy pushing that vision. But even though he's pushing it, it's going to be carried when your members pick it up and go. I mean, you've got to have that second generation, in that sense, buy-in, or you're going to push until your head's falling off. And what I found is, even with the communication degree, there are times I will say things, and I think the whole church got it, and the whole church understands it. And doesn't Andy Stanley say that you need to be able to repeat to the point that your people will repeat it back? And once they're able to repeat it back, they're just now getting it? I mean, we think oftentimes we just say, well, I have a really inflated view of my speaking. I think everybody should get it, right? But they don't, and my wife reminds me of that. They don't get it. Hey, I do want to touch on something here really quick before we move out of the 100, and that's the quality in ministries, okay? This can't be overlooked. Preaching, child care, those are some serious worship. You can't overlook the quality of what you do. And I think sometimes we can become guilty of saying, well, Easter's over, so this is Sunday after Easter, attendance is going to be down, so we don't really put the quality into it the week after Easter that we did on Easter. We're not serving people, we're serving the Lord primarily. And our quality needs to be the best it possibly can. The people that are coming to your church, if it's 100 and under, there is tremendous grace here. You have an advantage in the 100 and under on the quality of ministries. They're walking into a church of 50, they're not expecting you to have the ministry of a 500 church or 1,000 church. They understand there's grace. So we need to be able to take advantage of that, but not overlook the significance of the quality of ministry. That means we as leaders, we need to hone our craft if we're preachers, communicators. We need to be able to learn. There has never been a time where we can learn more than right now. I mean, I'm 42. I remember a time when there was something I didn't know and I couldn't know. Remember that? When you'd say, Dad, what about this? And you'd say, I don't know. We'll have to go look at your grandma's Encyclopedia Britannica to get the answer. in a couple days. We can know anything now. There's really very little excuse for us to not know how to improve on the areas that we need to improve on. Any other questions on the 100-person barrier?
I just might mention that to illustrate the need for consistent message over time, I think statistics are it takes 7 points of contact for a person to visit your church the first time. And if it takes 7 points of contact to get that one tiny step for a person to come to your church, why do we think that we can tell somebody in our church one time and it's going to change their life?
That's good.
If it took 7 points just to get one step, if we want to move our people, it's going to take a lot more than 7 to drastically alter their life.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I know the answer to this, but I want to put this out. We acquired some property back 18, 19 years ago. It was a nursing home in Belfast. Our Sunday school was there. We had a fundraiser to build a sanctuary night. Well, let's put it this way. During that time, we had 12, 13 deacons. We're down to 2 deacons now. So, and our church is about 6 blocks away. And we've been meeting since January, actually, myself, the other deacon, and pastor, were praying about this situation, about what we should be doing. What should we do? We're running anywhere from 45, 50 to 105, 110 on the great Sunday. And we've been up to 270. I've been up 20 odd years. So the question I have is, I know this answer. Should every effort be made to combine, to get those facilities together? Is that, I know that, I don't believe in building will come, but also if you already have a barrier that we're talking about because of the location. Now, those of us that have been members there out of this 40 plus, 80% of that has been there since we made that decision. So I'm okay with us doing what we're doing. But I know it's not conducive for growth. I know that. So, and like I said, we're down to 45, 38, 105. So, would you agree with what I'm thinking, that I want to say out, that every effort should be made to combine the facilities in some manner?
In what I understand from your story, it sounds like it would be wise to get those combined together. And I'll answer that with an illustration. When I was at Cherokee, it was a stick building, a stick worship center. It had a concrete block worship center originally, and then in the 80s they had built a stick building that was their worship center. They were separated by a wall with a door. So the worship center was here, and then back here, the old worship center turned into a fellowship hall and a Sunday school classroom. As we grew, we had to do something with our growth. So we ended up taking that wall out in between, and that was a real process. But once we opened that up, we had blue, little short turf carpet on the north end, and on the south end, we had nasty red shag carpet that was like this tall, and it had nothing under it since the concrete floors below it. So it would go through sweepers and vacuums. It was horrible. It was nasty. You remember that carpet, don't you?
Yeah.
It was like the blood of Christ red, and it was shaggy. It was horrible. It'd probably been laid in the 50s, honestly, to be truthful with you. The thing was, we in the church knew the story behind that carpet. We knew, oh yeah, well that's where the old building used to be. Now that they're tied in, we've grown, so we had to knock out a wall. It was kind of an endearing thing to us until I realized parents didn't want their kids crawling around on that nasty carpet. And then I had to realize, whoa, I'm not seeing this church the way outsiders see it. I'm not seeing this church the way people who are considering coming here see it. And I really need to be able to get a fresh perspective on this. So I applaud you on that, to be able to say, hey, this is a challenge. I see the challenge, and I see where that's a hindrance in our facilities. And to me, that sounds like a wise idea. And are children over there? Are children in that building?
Yeah, we have a nursery in the Sunday school as well as at the church. Of course, it's in the basement, and that's another issue too. But, we got facilities, but, we still got to do those. Everybody moves from Sunday school around 6 blocks. And like I said, I know the answer to that. We know the answer to that. I don't mean said, we got a fundraiser to the nannies, and we got the money is sitting there, and it's a pretty good chunk. I won't pay it all, but it's a big chunk, pretty big chunk. And so yes, I just, that's the third number.
Absolutely. Yeah, wow. Thank you for that. Here's the 200-person barrier. Most of the research says that 35% won't cross the 200. So you got 85%, according to most research, will not cross the 200 barrier. This one is significant. 85% of churches are 200 and under. Here's the interesting thing, is that seating capacity, you'll see up there, this now begins to be a larger issue. Because most of our churches in this area, most of our smaller churches, what are their worship centers built for? Yeah, and what's the seating capacity? Yeah. Even if you had a decent sized worship center of 150 or 200, you're not in the American church going to be able to sustain having 200 people come and sit in a 200 seat sanctuary. The 80% rule is a real thing. It is legitimate. It is as real as this chair I'm sitting on. It is. It's pretty wonky. Dare I say it's a loose stool? Oh, sorry. I mean, you don't get an opportunity like that often to throw those together. Here we go. Seating capacity becomes a bigger issue. If you've got a church that seats 200, you're starting to get up into 150, 160, 170. What are you going to do? I will tell you, consistency in message. For a year and a half, I've told our people, I've showed our people, I've acted it out in front of them to not cap the ends. You know what they do? They cap the ends. I literally acted it out. I acted like a new person. I went like in a business meeting, and I went. It was very awkward. I thought, oh yeah, they've got it. This is only the 108th time I've talked about it. They still cap the ends. It will be easier for you to add a second service than to try to get your church to not cap the ends. It is incredible at that point, at that stage. You don't want that seating capacity to sneak up on you. And in most of our churches, that's probably not the case. It's not going to sneak up on us, but we have to be aware of it. You're going to find your attitude toward growth. This is still going to be an issue. You're going to have people, this is starting to get further and further away from that family feel. People are starting to see control. There are people now serving on committees or teams and leadership that they don't know. That's going to be a big deal. You need to be able to be aware of that. Facilities. The increase in people is going to expose the issues you never saw before. The more people that come in, the more eyes, the fresh eyes, the rooms that you've now converted into classrooms or child rooms, you're going to realize when those are starting to be filled, it's going to expose the issues in your facility. Before you start getting close to 200, you really need to walk through and have an examination of your facilities to make sure that they are legit. Quality of ministries, preaching, child care groups. In the beginning, we knew that those were not as much of an issue. People's expectation of a 100-person church is not the same as a 200. As your attendance rises, so does the expectations of the people that are coming. They are expecting you now to start getting it together. You're also, somebody mentioned this earlier, the people that were coming and loved the family feel, they're going to be leaving now, some of them. You know why? Your church is too big. They came, they loved the family feel. It's not a family feel. I heard the other day that the average church loses 10% of its attendance every year through transfer or death. Have you heard that, Peck? Average church loses 10% of its attendance every year. I think I have a continuation here for us. Yes, these are a couple others. These are significant. These are not the ones that we're going to follow through all of them. But I wanted you to see shepherding and pastoral care. This is going to be big. This is huge. I keep a page of statistics on my desk. In fact, I brought it here with me. It's a statistic compiled from 7 different research facilities that we're talking about leadership and pastors and their roles. And it's not very pretty. Talking about the pastors, their moral failures, talking about pastors' burnout. Did you know only 1 out of 10 pastors will retire as a pastor? And I believe a lot of the reason, not all of it, but a significant amount of that reason is because those churches will get up to 200 and that pastor realizes, I can't keep doing everything that I've been doing. At this point, this stage, in order to be able to cross that 200 barrier and embrace whatever else is coming, you've got to be able to add some shepherding, some pastoral staff. You've got to be able to delegate. And why that's tough is the pastor in the 100-member church was everything to everybody. And it's easy for him to find his identity in being everything to everybody. And in order for me to be able to delegate something out, I have to realize I'm not going to be everything to everybody. And if I have found my identity in that, it's going to be really hard for me to let it go. I'm going to have to let someone else take over on that. And if we're micromanagers, it's going to be tough. We're going to have to be able to equip, train, and really release those people to be able to do those things. Or you will, it'll kill you. I really believe that there was a stage in my life where God did not give me some of the prayers I was asking for, especially in church growth, because he knew it would have wrecked me. There was no way I was ready for it. I'm not saying I'm ready for this now. We're all in over our heads. I'm going to be talking about that later. But I think if God would have answered my prayers regarding church growth when I prayed them, I'm pretty sure that it would have wrecked my family, it would have wrecked me, and in turn would have wrecked my church. I was not in a place to be able to handle it. 200 is also difficult because that's usually about the time you're adding another staff member. Worship pastors, right? They're tough. You're supposed to say something or act like that hurt. Children's ministers, so hard to get along with, right? Yeah. No, but seriously, think about it. If you're at a church that has not really been up to that 200 point and you're looking and you're seeing that there's some ministry needs that need to be taken care of and you're going to have to bring on maybe a part-time or even a full-time staff member, that's a real significant deal for a church that's never had another staff member.
You mentioned worship pastors, and I'm not casting dispersions in, but the worship pastor needs to be made to understand the context of your community, because he may have come from a strong contemporary area and be moving from coming to a church that is maybe a little more country, and they have to understand that there are going to be some adjustments that need to be made, and they need to be willing to make adjustments. If they're not willing to make adjustments, it's going to be a bad marriage, and you're going to be saying bye-bye.
And you know what happens in that? When you lose a staff member, you lose people. And you might just hop over that 200, run into an issue with bringing on a staff member, and boom, you're back down to 150 again. You're climbing back up. You're absolutely right. That's a really good point. But that is something for the church, and especially if they're voting on it. That's an area that they've really never been. If they're a single staff church and now they're asked to bring on another one, that is going to require a lot of leadership. Governance, that's the third one up there. That is really important. Because usually the 100 and under church, everybody had a vote on everything monthly, right? Everybody knew what was going on, had a chance to say whether it was official or unofficial. Now as that church begins to grow, people are not always going to get to know everything. They're not always going to have a say in everything. And if you're delegating things out, the channels are not going to be the same for them to get things done and to voice concerns. That's a real issue. You know what I did with my church? When I was in Joplin, I set them down. And I called a family meeting. This is a true story. I called a family meeting. And I didn't tell them what it was about. I just said, hey, I want to talk to y'all, family meeting. I've only called a family meeting twice in 20 years of ministry. And they knew it was important. And I sat on a stage. There was no music, no nothing. And I just said, guys, here's the deal. I said, we're growing. And we're growing to the point that not everybody is going to know everything that's going on. We're not going to be able to vote on everything. We're going to have to allow our teams to do what our teams do. And I just had that conversation with them. It was a loving conversation. I let them know, man, we're here and we're trying to deal with this the best we can. And we just want you to know these are some things coming up. And as soon as I was able to lay out my expectations and what I believed was going to happen, they were okay with it. And they understood the situation that we were in. So a lot of that was just having that open lines of communication. My former DOM used to say, what your church is not up on, they're down on. And I think there's a lot of truth on that. Any other thoughts about any of these 200 people, 200 person barriers, the seating capacity, attitude toward growth, facilities, quality of ministry, people, and then shepherding and pastoral care. You're going to have to rely heavy on your deacons or others in that, adding a staff member, governance, and stress on leadership.
I was just thinking that on the shepherding and pastoral care, and then also on the governance, that you just kind of have it. Those are long-term processes in changing the perspective of the church. But I know that there's this perspective, both on leadership side and on the congregation side, that if somebody's sick, they want to see the pastor. And to break that numerical barrier, you've got to break that perception. Or you have to give something else up.
Yeah.
If the senior pastor wants to be that, you can do that, but you're going to spend 50% of your time doing it. And so there will be other things that senior pastor has to give up. And what usually ends up happening is that the pastoral care suffers. Because the pastor's the only one doing it, but then the pastor's not available all the time. And so there's this stuff that goes by the wayside.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was also thinking in church governance that's an issue, whatever size you're at. I worked at a church that had 400 plus people, but there was a group of fewer than 10 who, you were talking about not everyone will always have a say. This group of 10, whatever their responsibilities were in the church, they always wanted to have a say. And so they were not comfortable with giving authority away. And that has to be something that we get good at as, I'm going to vote you into authority and then I'm going to let you have that
Yeah.
authority and support them.
When you say at 200, I'm going to do pastoral care, but other things are going to suffer. You can't keep doing that as that church grows, because you're putting expectations. Your people will then have an expectation. He's going to do it, and it's just as you grow, you're just going to find yourself wiped out.
Yeah.
And when you're wiped out, your preaching is wiped out, your leadership is wiped out, your home is wiped out. I mean, it is so hard. So thankfully, I said in retrospect, I was able to look back and I saw people, Saunders, the deacons that we had, be able to come along and to do visitation and to be equipped to be able to do that and love to do it. And so it's not just about one person, but finding those people and sending them out.
You had mentioned 2 services. Can you just talk a little bit about pros and cons of 2 services and what's the transition from 1 to 2?
What I know about that is, one thing I'll tell you is, depending on the size of your worship center, what we have done is, when we went to 2 services, we did a reciprocating service. So we had Sunday school at 1 hour, or small groups at 1 hour, and then worship at the other, and then flock. So there was always something going on, and that worked well for us. Another thing that was important for us is we have a worship center that seats 500, or more if we wanted it to, but really, in reality, it seats 500. We did not want to have one group come in that was 300 and one group come in that was 150. And there is something called the intensity of density in worship. And you probably know a lot about that as a worship pastor. It's significant when you walk into a room and it's dense. There is an intensity when you walk into a room that is filled or at least spaced out. So for us, realizing we wanted that intensity of density, we brought in pipe and drape. And we use that, so it's a flexible means to help us keep our space dense enough where people don't just feel like they're in this huge echo chamber. You know what I mean? So it's really been good. I would also say, depending on your church context, we chose to not change worship styles. That was something that was our decision. A lot of that was based off of who was going to be a part of our worship team. And frankly, for us, we felt if we're growing with this style, then why would we want to go change that at that time? And for us, I think it would have invited dissension and a division in the church, and something we didn't really want. Service times are another important thing. When we first did 2 services, We didn't have enough time in between. That was a factor. People like time in between, but you're never going to find a time that everybody was. Ever. Yeah, talk to Ben about it. Oh, those stiff-necked people.
I have one. I don't know if I have a question, but because I'm trying to think of how to ask the question. But something that we have been struggling with, and I've been struggling with when it comes to the governance. Like, I totally get the idea that not everybody's going to know everything, you can't vote on everything, and all that stuff. And honestly, I think that the church that I'm pastoring is probably going to be okay with that. There seems to be more and more people that are like, yeah, go ahead, you decide, you know. But I guess what I've been contemplating is at what point, because the reason that right now and in the past that everybody has known everything, everybody voted everything, one is because we were smaller, but the other reason is because the church constitution says that we do that, right? It says that we meet this amount of times, and when there's this decision gets voted on, this decision gets voted on, this decision gets voted on. Not all of them are listed in there, but there are some of them that do. And so what I'm trying to wade through is at what point do I move from just a conversation, hey, you know, we have a children's minister now, she can make some of these decisions, or to now we need a structural, constitutional change in how we go about making decisions. Maybe we just have an annual business meeting that votes on budget, you know, or instead of quarterly. Like, that's one of the things that I'm really kind of trying to wade through and struggle with. I don't know if that's a question, but that's something that I'm struggling with. So,
At what point do you get that you move away from either your quarterly to one thing?
Right.
I've known some churches, other churches I pastored actually did this completely, but we did change a lot of the way we did things. But some of the churches that did one meeting, they did budget and the election of teams. And do you have any questions about these specific areas? Talk to these team members. We entrust this in their hands because they came from a wide range of people in the church. And you get to, I think that that's the most efficient way of working. But I can't say you're going to have everybody happy.
Well, when it comes to the Constitution and bylaws in a church, the Constitution and bylaws in the church are supposed to serve the mission.
Yes.
The mission's not supposed to serve those documents. Now, that's not to say that they're not relevant. They're a guiding assistance in us in how we execute the mission. But if you find that your documents are not helping you achieve the mission, that you don't change the mission, you've got to go back and change the documents. But if you're going to change it, make sure you get all your changes in. Try to do that in one. I used to think that a big church was just a larger version of a small church. Not so. It is its own animal. These are a couple quotes up there. Many of you probably know Carey Nieuwhof, Warren Bird. That is a great book, by the way, How to Break Growth Barriers. It's been around a long time. It is revised. But Carl George and Warren Bird, that is a wonderful, wonderful book if you're interested in taking this further. 400-person barrier. We're supposed to be done here. Let's move through these. Seating capacity is not going to be as much of an issue for most of us because our churches, worship centers, were built for about 175, 200, so you probably at this point already figured that one out. Attitude towards growth. The one that was an issue before, you're not seeing it as much of an issue now. It's really starting to decline. Facilities are still going to be significant factors. If they're unaddressed when you're at 200, they're going to be a bigger factor when you're at 400. Quality of ministries is going to be a bigger factor. People have higher expectations now that your church is larger. Shepherding and family care. I love this quote by Carl George down at the bottom. In virtually every case I've studied, churches lose more people to neglect than schism. We do something, we have a process queue for what it's worth. What it is it allows us to be able to gather information on new members when they fill out a connection card. Any of you guys have any records? How many of your churches keep records of first-time guests? Do you ask the people to fill out that information? Okay, great. Do you follow up? Does your church follow up on that?
I mean, if they get
What I have found is the simplest, the best. The simplest bit of information that allows me to get. By the way, if you guys are taking notes, you may want to jot this down. It's Church for the Rest of Us podcast. Jimmy Scroggins at West Palm Beach, Florida, Family Church. Church for the Rest of Us podcast. It's episode 32, 33, 34, and 35. Great podcast on how to be able to track and get first-time guests to be able to come back. I'm told by Tom Rayner, not personally, I heard Tom Rayner say that a healthy church has as many first-time guests in a year as it does average attendance.
What was the number?
Episode 32, 33, 34, and 35. Think about that for a minute. A healthy church has the same amount of first-time guests in a year as it does average attendance.